The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands, of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the 7th and final day of this 7-day sesshin in January 2020 at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico, and we will continue sharing more of the writings of Chris Niebauer, Professor Chris Niebauer, in his book, No Self, No Problem, How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism. It is quite interesting what he's pointing out if you've been if you've been listening to the previous Teishos. He gets into the anatomy of the brain and points out that the left brain is the seat of language. It is where we think. And the right brain is where we understand, but we don't think. It's more of an intuitive sense, and that it is in our culture that left brain dominance exists. We prize intellect, we prize the ability to speak well, to achieve high results in science, mathematics, or whatever field we're involved in, to excel in a world of words, in a world of ideas, in a world of thoughts. But he also points out that that world exists only in our own head. Not only just only in our head, but in the left side of our head, in that left hemisphere, because that's the world that creates stories out of what it observes. It thinks, or at least it creates thoughts, and thoughts are not reality. Just consider that for a moment. In order to come to awakening, we need to, if you want to talk scientifically, I suppose, cross over into right brain understanding and see what is beyond words and thoughts and ideas to a deeper level of truth. And of course, both are essential for navigating the world. We would not be able to read. We will not be able to understand language if that left brain were offline, or if the left brain were damaged, and therefore offline in a different way. So both sides are essential, but it's important to recognize that if we are biased in terms of words and thoughts and ideas, then we're going to only create more stories and miss the fundamental truth of reality. And yet it is the truth of reality. It is reality, the experience of reality itself, that allows us to be fulfilled with compassion, with wisdom, with understanding, with joy. And it is the world of words and stories that is fundamental to the creation of suffering. In an earlier chapter we spoke of yesterday, Dr. Niebauer talks about the experience of another scientist who was a neuroanatomist, which is quite fascinating because she was able to actually put into words later on, more or less, analyze what exactly had happened when she had a major stroke in 1996. When the stroke was so intense and so big that it basically, at least temporarily, shut down her left brain. So the thought processes, the words, the ability for language were not there for her, but what she fell into, because her right brain remained online, was an amazing experience of what she later thought was perhaps what Buddhists call nirvana. And in a TED Talk, she talks about her, I think it's her stroke of enlightenment or her stroke of insight. I don't remember which the title was. And it was life-changing for her in very positive ways. One of the major things that she did was that she ceased doing experiments with animals. Remember, she's a brain anatomist, a neuroanatomist. Nerves and brain is the major nerve. And in order to understand the anatomy, she had to pick apart brains, literally. And therefore, in some cases, I suspect, with live animals. At any rate, it did change her whole life in a very positive direction. Eventually, she was able to return to science, and although it took 8 years before her brain could come back online fully, but she was amazed by what she experienced with just the right brain online. It may be that in our experiences of oneness, emptiness, our experiences of insight, our kensho, which is literally insight, it's insight into the nature of reality, seeing into the nature of reality, come from being able to access the right brain in a major way and allow the left brain to take second seat. So he continues in this book, which is quite fascinating, called No Self, No Problem, How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism, explaining how he has reached the point where he feels that this so-called self is a fiction. And Buddhism has taught that for a very long time. No eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, no color, sound, smell, taste, touch, or what the mind takes hold of, nor even active sensing. No ignorance, nor end of it, nor all that comes of ignorance. No withering, no death, no end of them, nor is there pain, or cause of pain, or cease in pain, or noble path to lead from pain, not even wisdom to attain. Attainment too is emptiness. This is the Prajnaparamita, or part of the Prajnaparamita, which is considered to be the core teaching of the Buddha. And when we realize this experientially, life is different. We're not so caught in things. We're not so inclined to create suffering for ourselves or for anyone else or anything else. So we are now in chapter 5, Meaning and Understanding. And here he has a quote that is supposed to be by the Buddha: to understand everything is to forgive everything. And in a certain way, that is true. Just had an email from someone who has reached a point of frustration with practice. This person has tried any number of different practices, not just Buddhism, by the way. He has tried all the major religions and in Est and a few other things as well, Native American spirituality, and has remained dissatisfied, frustrated, really. And he wrote that he has an increased recognition that all beings are perfect, whole, and complete, which is a tenet of Buddhism. But what it has done for him has caused him to be, sounds like, quite judgmental and less patient with people for their ways in which they aren't expressing that innate perfection. If we go deep enough in our practice, we are profoundly accepting of people's foibles. there's a great compassion that arises when we see people unwittingly causing themselves and others pain and suffering. We know how they could be. We know that it's innate in them. And we recognize with empathy that they just aren't ready to be there yet. And so in that sense, when he quotes the Buddha as saying, to understand everything is to forgive everything, it makes sense in that way. So, meaning and understanding. Meaning and understanding are two of the vital processes that take place in the right brain. This often surprises my students to hear, since the left brain seems to be the one doing all the thinking. But as you will see in this chapter, while the left brain focuses on the parts, the right brain looks at the whole, where meaning and understanding reside. A good way to see this is through example. So let's do a quick exercise. Read the following paragraph from Context and Memory by M. Klein very carefully. A newspaper is better than a magazine. A seashore is a better place than the street. At first, it's better to run than to walk. You may have to try several times. It takes some skill, but it is easy to learn. Even young children can enjoy it. Once successful, complications are minimal. Birds seldom get too close. Rain, however, soaks in very fast. Too many people doing the same thing can also cause problems. One needs lots of room. If there are no complications, it can be very peaceful. A rock will serve as an anchor. If things break loose from it, however, you will not get a second chance. That's the end of the quote. How does it feel? It doesn't feel quite right, does it? Maybe a bit random or meaningless? Most likely your interpretive consciousness took in each specific word, understanding individual definitions, and yet not grasping any meaning that would glue it all together. Now go back and read it again, this time with the understanding that the passage is about flying a kite. So we'll read part of it. A newspaper is better than a magazine, and a seashore is a better place than the street. At first, it's better to run than to walk. And you may have to try several times. It takes some skill, but it's easy to learn. Even young children can enjoy it. And so on and so forth. Now, it all makes sense, doesn't it? The right side of the brain makes it possible. Almost every cognitive task depends on meaning. Meaning allows us to hold information in short-term or long-term memory, and thus is the foundation of cognition. For instance, imagine that you need to memorize one of the two sentences below. Which do you choose and why? The first one is, Martin Luther King Jr., winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, gave a speech about civil rights at the Lincoln Memorial. Now, the second sentence, apple, purple, bench, 7 whales in Texas flew south. Oven rust runs faster when it slides on 27 roads. And that's a clue as to why it's more difficult to memorize nonsense, or what for us appears to be nonsense because we don't have a translation of the words. And here I'm thinking of some of the chants that are originally from India, originally in Sanskrit or Pali, and then got transliterated into Chinese, which then got transliterated into Japanese, which then got spoken into English by English-speaking people. And I'm speaking here of the Dharanis, the Great Compassion Dharani, as it's called in English, the Daihishin Dharani, or the Dharani to remove disasters, which is the Shosaimyo Kajijo Dharani. Since most people don't know Sanskrit or Pali these days, although I do have a doctor who did study Sanskrit, that was one of the 4 languages he was taught in grade school. He grew up in India, and so he learned Sanskrit, English, Hindi, and his own native South Indian language. And I don't remember what that was called. The more we can connect what appears to be nonsense together, the greater possibility of committing it to memory. And I think here also of, we chant the Prajna Paramita, the Hanya Shingyo as it's known in Japanese. And if you don't know Japanese, then that's also a strung together series of nonsense syllables as well. But it is possible to learn these chants even if you don't know the language. And he goes into a little bit of how. So with regard to those two sentences, each of the above has the same number of words, but most everyone would agree that A, Martin Luther King sentence, is much easier to hold in memory than B, the apple purple bench sentence. That is because we can process it in meaningful chunks such that Martin Luther King Jr. becomes one meaningful piece of information rather than many. Because of meaning, A is easier to hold in memory. When I see students in the hallways with cards trying to memorize facts for an exam, it takes everything I have not to burst into a lecture on the importance of meaning for both short-term and long-term memory. In the 1970s, psychology introduced a theory called levels of processing, but it could very well be called levels of meaning. The theory was very simple. If you process the meaning, you will remember it. But if you process only the surface features by just reading it to yourself or looking at the words, it will be forgotten. And this is why when people come new into the Zendo and they're first experiencing the chanting that takes place, which is an ancient tradition that's began with the repetition of the amazing memory of Ananda, who was the Buddha's assistant, attendant for many years, 30 years, something like that, and had a photographic memory and could remember word for word everything the Buddha said. And so he repeated it for the assembly of senior monks, and that tradition has carried down to the day. And even when I was living in Mandalay in the 1960s, and Burma was a very Buddhist country, something like 80% of the people that lived in Burma were considered to be Buddhist. And by the way, we will not get into the whole thing with the pogrom against the Rakhine people, because that was fomented by a so-called monk who is anything but Buddhist, though he wears the robes. So in Mandalay, on the far side of the old palace, there were, and on the other side of the moat that surrounded the old palace, there were some shelters, a number of shelters. I think there were 4 of them, all in a row, and every year monks from all over Burma would come, and there would be competitions to recite the Pali Sutras. Traditionally, in many cultures, there have been at least the tradition of recitation of history, the traveling minstrels in some countries, and troubadours, and it's still, when I was in Uzbekistan back in the early 1990s, no, it was the late 1990s, it was still a tradition in those countries. When we repeat and pause to repeat inwardly to ourselves, and then go on, practice, basically. And I don't mean repeating the whole darn thing. I mean going through a segment and repeating it and sort of getting the feel of the words in our body, getting the feel of the meaning in our body. And if there's no meaning, then ascribing some level of familiarity with the sounds. Then we can memorize. But to read the chants right from the get-go in the assumption that you will learn them that way is a mistake. Better to listen and try to follow along with the words or the sense or the sounds, even if you don't know the words or understand the words. And through that level of repetition, not through seeing words on paper, you're much more able to memorize these chants. And not only memorize the chants, but get beyond the words to the meanings. The theory, this is the theory of levels of meaning. The theory is very simple. If you process the meaning, you will remember it. But if you process only the surface features by just reading it to yourself or looking at the words, it will be forgotten. This happens all the time. The next time you have a book and actually want to remember what you've read, read 2 or 3 paragraphs, close the book, and then ask yourself, what did I just read? You can do it right now. Close this book and say out loud what this chapter has covered so far. You may be surprised to find you're met with a blank nothingness because you were just processing the surface features. However, if you practice and ask yourself this question regularly as you read, and that will also sort of instigate a kind of deeper sensing beneath the words as you're reading, you will get better at retaining meaning and creating long-term memories of what you read. Finding meaning isn't just about improving your memorization skills, of course. Finding meaning may be the purpose of life itself. In one of the most powerful books showing the importance of meaning in the human condition, Man's Search for Meaning, psychiatrist Viktor Frankl describes his experience in the Nazi death camps during World War II. He begins with a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche: "He who has a why to live for let's start this over again. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." Frankl contended that an inmate's sense of meaning and purpose was a factor in his or her ability to survive in the camps. Frankl concluded that meaning is more important than happiness and called his form of therapy logotherapy because logos translates as meaning. Frankl believed that it is, quote, the very pursuit of happiness that thwarts happiness, close quote. And this has also been expressed in Buddhism. If you try to be happy, it's going to escape you. Meanwhile, psychology and much of culture has been on a pursuit of happiness crusade for at least the last 30 years. However, the current research is backing up Frankl's insight. In one study, subjects listened to music while half of them tried as hard as they could be to be happy. The half that tried to be happy were less happy than the group that just listened. Another study found that those who put a high value on happiness had more negative emotions. Of course, long ago the Buddha explained how desire leads to suffering, and this seems to hold even for the desire to be happy. Any new parent can tell you that meaning is different than happiness. In fact, becoming a new parent is one of the clearest ways to trade ego happiness for meaning and never look back. In my own case, because I'm no good at breastfeeding, my job as a new parent was changing diapers. I've changed thousands of diapers, and I vividly recall the array of fluids and solids that came my way during those first few years. My sleep was reduced to far less than half of what it had previously been. My moment-to-moment existence was outwardly miserable in many ways. Yet, I wouldn't trade being a parent for anything in the world, then or now. Only meaning could ever make such a deal worth being grateful for. Or, to put it another way, if you have a why, you can deal with any how. And the next subject is understanding. Many of us are told that to think about something is to understand it. Unless we are studying Buddhism, or I should say practicing Buddhism, not studying Buddhism. If we're practicing Buddhism, we're taught that thought is not going to bring us to awakening. That, in fact, thought can very readily inhibit awakening. That in order to come to awakening, and in order to experience reality for yourself, rather than think about a picture of it or a story about it, you have to go beneath the level of words. And that, if Dr. Niebauer is correct, means accessing more readily your right brain and allowing the left brain, the narrator, the judge, the comparator, and all the rest to take a back seat. We've said previously that people get alarmed when in their practice suddenly thoughts come up in a major way. And this is because our mind is beginning to settle down, and that puts the left brain on high alert. In another way of expressing it, we can feel like we're going to die or we're going to disappear. And so a level of panic erupts and a flood of thoughts come to try to shift the view back to thinking. But this extended out-breath is an amazingly powerful practice. For one, if you're really correctly extending the out-breath, it's impossible to multitask. In other words, if you're experiencing your body, the energy in your body, the raw, palpable experience of breathing out and extending that out-breath beyond where you would ordinarily breathe back in again, then thoughts diminish. In fact, they can even cease. And as we've said a number of times, that can bring up its own set of anxiety and panic. But take heart. It's not a bad sign. Tune in. What does that panic feel like in your body? Go right into that experience. At the end of the out-breath, when that anxiety begins to rise, tune in, feel. Don't think, and recognize when the experience of that is turning two-dimensional, which means you're backing out of it, and go back more completely into the body so that it is a three-dimensional, full body experience. And you will find yourself, if you do this again and again, at an amazing threshold into a deeper way of being. So, the writings of Isaac Newton, whose work forms the foundation of modern science, follows a pattern of interpretive understanding. For instance, many Westerners still view the universe as a vast machine, similar to a clock. A simple mechanical clock has a few gears, a power supply, and a winding system which all work together to make some hands move around on a dial. Imagine you understand the details about each piece of a clock and how they work together. You could put together and take apart gears and dials, but might never know what a watch is or does. It is the same with the universe. The narrow window of interpretive consciousness is only aware of one thing at a time and totally in the dark about the glue that binds it all together. Seeking a true understanding of a clock or of the universe is like reading the previous passage on flying a kite. It requires something more than the individual parts. A classic example given by Newton is one billiard ball hitting another. We can see one ball hitting the next, and it has a nice one thing at a time quality. A hits B, and then B moves. Every part of the transaction can be described with words, and anything that cannot be described with words is off limits. When we describe Newton's version of the universe as one ball causing another to move, the left brain might say, I understand. Why does my car make a strange noise? The muffler went bad and needs to be replaced. Why do I have a pain in my stomach? There's too much acid and I need to take medicine to fix it. In fact, this one thing causing something else is at the core of science and a reflection of how the interpretive mind works to break the world into parts, categories, and differences. The left brain does this all the while never grasping that none of it would be possible without the powers of the right brain to guide and make sense of the whole enterprise. This is not to say that the simple left brain form of understanding isn't ever in agreement with reality. Sometimes, if I replace the muffler in my car, the sound does go away. If I take an antacid, my stomach does feel better. This form of understanding has been instrumental in those breakthroughs that gave us flight, took us to the moon, and now has us moving in cars that drive themselves. While seeing one thing at a time is a necessary and useful process, it is fundamentally dependent on the larger vision taking place in the right brain. This is ironic when you consider how the left brain masquerades as the master. We need the right brain to understand the purpose of a car or our digestive system, and only then can we focus on the specific parts that construct these larger processes. And then he gets into metaphor, which again is something that the left brain does not understand. The right brain, the brain that goes beyond words, understands. And he quotes Emily Dickinson, I think, somewhere, as love is like a feather. And it makes no sense when considered literally, but people understand. People that have right brain damage don't understand poetry or metaphor because they take it literally. He has some other examples. Trying first to describe what love is, one might say love is like a rose, beautiful but with thorns that can hurt sometimes. At work, we can get ahead, fall behind, or make it to the top. In these metaphors, we're mapping an abstraction onto a perception. All metaphors call on both left and right brain. Here again, it is the left that relies on the right. Metaphors make connections that are beyond literal meaning, even if the left brain sometimes takes them to be literal. Imagine if someone offered you an idea that was food for thought, but you refused, explaining you just ate. Similarly, thinking that the universe is a clock-like machine might be a useful metaphor. Given free rein with this metaphor, however, the left brain might lead us straight down a literal path to a tragic conclusion. What if we're also only a machine within an ever larger, lifeless machine? This line of thinking will most certainly lead to suffering. Equating perception with understanding is the essence of metaphor. We take something abstract and connect it to a right brain experience, hoping that the left brain will get it. There's a large body of research showing the right brain is critical in metaphor, and that individuals with damage to the right brain will take poems, metaphors, and sarcasm literally. Again, that's already been mentioned. There's a long tradition in both philosophy and religion of using metaphors in the quest for understanding, especially in the East. The Pali Canon is a collection of writings, typically considered the best record of the Buddha's teachings. This text includes over 1,000 metaphors. In Buddhism, the mind is like a pool because its water clears when left alone, and the, quote, middle path, close quote, conveys moderation. Even the phrase, the Buddha, is grounded in metaphor because the original Pali term simply means one who is awake. If taken literally, this would mean that anyone who isn't sleeping is a Buddha, though of course being awake in this context means being conscious of reality rather than hypnotized by our dreamlike stories about reality. With metaphor, the brain is making a connection between a pattern of neural activity and the real, genuine world. Perhaps the reason Buddhism and other spiritual traditions use metaphor so frequently is because they sidestep the gatekeeping functions of the interpretive mind. And the other side of it is that since reality cannot be described because then it's a story, it has to be realized. Metaphor can point at it more readily than words, regular words can. And he goes also into the role of spatial processing that is a function of the right brain. And then he talks about within that spatialness, the function of space. In other words, we could not understand letters without the space around the lines. We could not understand words without the space around the word. We couldn't understand a figure without the space around a figure. Emptiness is vital. Many quotes the Prajnaparamita: form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not separate from form. Form is not separate from emptiness. Whatever is form is emptiness, and whatever is emptiness is form. We can understand that literally in words, now that science has begun to realize that, for example, the human body is more emptiness than it is form. There's more space between the atoms and molecules that make up our body than there is the atoms and molecules themselves. But that doesn't free us, that intellectual understanding. Comprehending what form is emptiness and emptiness is form really expresses is liberating. And it's liberating in a way that cannot be expressed in words. And it's part of the profound liberation that can take place through moving beyond words, through our Zen practice. We are tied to words. We are taught that words are most important, that stories, that intellectual understanding is vital. And to a certain degree, it is vital. But it's not going to take us to awakening. And it's awakening that will provide us with the most amazing freedom beyond comprehension, the only real freedom there is. We can be in the midst of prison, and that freedom is still manifest if we have realized deeply enough the true nature of reality. These last few hours of sesshin, take this to heart, drop the words, plunge deep through the perplexity that brought you to practice to begin with. Reach beyond words, way beyond words. Dare to sail outside of the sight of land and explore. It'll be worth it. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.